warmly welcome all of you to this webinar on human capital innovation, India's roadmap for dignified economic growth. We are looking at these issues, and we have, let me also thank our distinguished panelists. To start with Rijesh Upadhyay, the General Secretary of Bharatiya Mazdoor Sangh, Shumita Ghosh, Founder and Managing Director, Rangasutra, Rituparna Chakravarti, Co-Founder and Executive Vice President of Team Lease, Bharat Waklu, Founder and President of Waklu Advisory, who has worked with the Tata Administrative Service for long, and Sanjay Srivastav, last but not the least, a business thought leader and strategic advisor. He's also worked with Tata and Mahindra until very recently. With that, let me request Trineni to please make a presentation on the various models for facilitating worker welfare in Indian industries. Trineni and Sarthak are two of my colleagues in this team who will be doing the presentation.
Right, sir. Can I request Trineni for first giving a few house announcements, and then we can quickly go through the presentation in 5 minutes.
Okay, good idea.
Trineni, house announcements, please.
Sure. So I'll just take a minute to explain everyone the protocols of the webinar. Firstly, all participants are panelists are requested to remain on mute for the duration of the webinar until and unless it's their turn to speak, and we will unmute them, or they have the option to unmute themselves. And everyone is requested to put in their questions or any comments in the chat box and direct them to the host, or just as a general message to everyone. And you can raise your hands if you have any other questions during the webinar. And thank you. We can now go forward with the presentation.
Sure. So before jumping straight to the discussion of the day, which is on the note on models for facilitating worker welfare, let me just quickly set the context right for these presentations to follow. The pandemic in which we are in has widened and in many cases busted open some of the fault lines that our system has normalized now. One such fault line is the capital-labor relationship, or to frame it more rightly, the relationship between financial capital and human capital. And the system that I'm referring to is the wheel of the economic growth, the cogs of which are the actors of government, industry, and the people. While the government intends to keep everyone happy or ensure precisely sabka saath, sabka vishwas, and sabka vikas, the government, the industry and people are primarily in the game for one reason, that is profit generation, institutional and individual profits. And the models of industrial growth that have been in place now have failed to deliver on this. A testimony to this is the wide gap that we are witnessing between the on-paper reports and the actual ground level realities of workers and small businesses alike. Concepts like stakeholder to shareholder, sustainable development, inclusive growth, all have been shelved on our desks for long, but haven't reached the ground realities. While the pandemic has brought the plight of precarious workers to the front pages of our newspapers, there is still an innate fear in how the state is responding to this. A skewed focus on industrial recovery, which is devoid of human centricity, is more likely to take us back to the vicious circle we were in than out of it. And this detachment between economic growth and humans is also multi-layered. One is that growth is decoupled from the workers, which results in what we call the income inequality and the narratives that we are hearing about a K-shaped recovery where rich will be more richer and poor more poorer by the day. While the other layer in which this growth is devoid of human centricity is the human aspects of it. Something which this slide shows the different indicators of worker well-being on which India is performing quite poorly at the ground levels. We will be now sharing a note with you, which highlights a few models that can potentially transform this interaction between industry and workers with the objective of balancing the interest of different stakeholders and creating a win-win situation for them. And I'd emphasize on the phrase win-win situation for all to draw a reference to the 50th anniversary of the famous New York Times piece of Nobel laureate Milton Friedman, who propounded the shareholder maximization concept while stating that the only social responsibility of businesses is to maximize profits. I'm sure if Mr. Friedman would have lived to see the disturbing pictures of migrant workers plying on Indian roads for hundreds of kilometers, even he would agree to revisit the definition of shareholder that he propounded that time. If buying financial equity in a business makes you a shareholder and your interests are kept at the helm of business affairs, then the hard work equity, sweat equity, and the intellectual equity that workers bring in are of no less significance. With this context in place, I'd now request Trineni to now jump to the different models that can potentially achieve these objectives. These models are derived from our observational learnings from the ground, as well as the economic stream of economic regulation and regulatory governance, which are now gaining prominence. Over to you, Trineni, for the models.
Right, am I audible?
Yes.
So I'll take you all through three different models that we have proposed, which are initiatives towards improving worker welfare by businesses or enterprises. The first model that we are going to look at is the one which links enterprise with worker welfare using economic incentives and making it a positive sum game for both the employers as well as the employees. So how does this exactly work? The main principle is an algorithm or a sort of a mathematical basis where we link the performance of an enterprise in terms of what initiatives it is taking for the welfare of its workers. It could be equal wages, it could be good working conditions, it could be fair pay, it could be various such capacity building initiatives, and these are ranked using indicators for performance, and that can be fed into the algorithm to increase the price that this enterprise can charge for its final product, the product that it is manufacturing. So this is essentially a way in which and a positive initiative taken by the enterprise for its workers can effectively increase the price that it is asking for its products. Can you move to the next slide, please? So how can this be implemented? This model can be implemented using two different approaches. Firstly, the basis firstly would be doing a need assessment on the ground and looking at those sectors or those industries where worker welfare is a sore point, and then going about implementing these performance indicators and implementing this particular algorithm based model in those particular sectors as a pilot, and then sort of generalize it to other industries and sectors. Or it could also be implemented in the form of linking it with existing government procurement channels or government schemes, such as the government e-market that we have, and institutionalize ethical procurement in these processes. And how can we ensure compliance in this particular model? That can be done using third-party audits. It can be done using public information dissemination processes, and also by an initial hands-on approach by the government, where initially we have a strong role of the government in the implementation of the entire models so as to provide the necessary support, and then moving forward over the long term, going for a self-regulatory approach. Next slide, please. So the second model that we want to propose is centered around the entire idea of using information as a tool for improving performance of a particular enterprise. And this is something very similar to a credit rating system or a rating ranking system that we are very familiar with these days, something akin to what Zomato or Uber, you see restaurants being rated on Zomato, or you see cab drivers being given a rating on Uber, and how that is directly linked to their performance. So over here, we are proposing a model in which an enterprise's performance will be ranked, and it will be there in the public forum, and that will actually voluntarily help it improve its own performance. The ranking is going to be a tool for improving its own performance. How do we go about it? This is basically premised on standardized indicators for performance, and creating a ranking system based on those performance indicators, and then finally putting it on the public forum. And this can be scaled up by tying up with the government, and by building capacities. Next slide, please. So one of the examples of this particular model that is currently there in practice is Fairware, which is essentially an initiative of a platform of entrepreneurs in the textile and clothing supply chain, which advocate for ethical labor practices across the supply chain from production to retail. And here these ILO stipulated standards, 8 ILO stipulated standards are used, and they are adhered to for this entire performance rating process. Next slide, please. The third model that we want to propose is using certification, or certification process as a regulation of an enterprise's performance. And over here, the highlight would be a participatory mechanism where we involve the employers to build the standards that will be followed for worker welfare, and then issuing certificates to enterprises as as a mark for their upholding these standards and following these particular protocols. And similarly, similar to the second model, this can also be compliance can be ensured through audits, and it can be scaled up using labels over here, very similar to the hallmark or the agmark labels that are used currently for quality of gold or quality of agricultural products. Next slide, please. So one example of this particular model that is currently in practice is the Good Weave certification, or the Good Weave tag, that is being used again in the textile and clothing industry, which aims to eliminate child labor, bonded labor, and forced labor, and ensure worker welfare mechanisms through the Good Weave tag that is given to enterprises or retail brands that follow these particular protocols. Next slide, please. So how do we ensure the sustainability of these models? The way to go forward would be creating a compact between businesses, workers, and the government, and initiating a behavioral change mechanism which involves all the three stakeholders. So in the long term, it has to be an effective change in the perspective and behavior of all the three stakeholders, which can actually bring about a shift from looking at workers as costs of production to workers as human capital. And also in the long term, the government has to, the models have to move from having a strong role of government towards self-regulation in order to ensure sustainability. Next slide, please. So I would like to conclude the presentation by setting the context for today's discussion, which is about human capital. And so the primary aim of all the three models that I discussed right now is to shift the perspective from of looking at workers from as a cost of production to human capital as an asset for production. And that can only be done when businesses actually look at initiatives to improve worker productivity. And how can that happen? That can happen by first of all using economic principles. So in economics, a production function is simply a mathematical function that links out inputs and outputs, costs and profits of an enterprise. But what equation we put in human capital. So what goes into actually valuing a worker in the production process and looking at the economics of it, maybe looking at the number of hours he is working, or the capacity building initiatives that an enterprise can take, or the wages that the enterprise is providing. And all of these, if you have a look at the equation on the slide, all of these actually lead to an increased revenue for an enterprise, and that actually leads to profits for an enterprise. So as we say that when a thing is valued, then it's a positive sum game for everyone. So I'd like to end on that, and looking forward to a very interesting discussion on how we can have workers being looked at as human capital. Thank you.
Thank you, Sarthak and Trineni, for this excellent presentation. But what we forgot to mention is this presentation or this webinar is a part of a project that we are undertaking with the support of the Ford Foundation, the Good and Better Jobs. And the research that we have done is, a lot of the understanding has come out from our empirical work as well as desk research. So we'll continue with that. Now, we are aware that globally, in the context of human capital index, India is pretty low. Now, the various factors go into it. It's not just how enterprises treat workers, but also education, healthcare, etc., etc. 101 other things which we are familiar with adds to the human capital index. But at this particular point, what we're looking at is how do enterprises treat their workers, as contributors to their activity or as cost factors? And if at all, either cost factor or contributor, whichever way they look at it, whether they treat the same with the kind of respect and dignity which is a desirable factor in terms of the fact that he or she is also a human being. And he and she may not be an entrepreneur in that sense, maybe a provider of services, yet is an important and relevant cog in the wheel. Now, human capital is one of the fundamental requirements for any industrial activity. To produce outputs and thus generate profits. It is crucial at every stage of an industrial process in both the local and global context. Let me continue. For an enterprise or economy to grow, the capacity of its human capital, including its social, political, and economic well-being, act as a major driving factor. In fact, it can be categorically stated that the productivity of human capital is directly proportional to its well-being. However, the industrial sector has downplayed this fundamental concept of economic activity and thus bearing its cost time and again. It is not to say that the industrial sector hasn't made any efforts towards, it is not to say that the industry has kept pace with the emerging technology, but has simultaneously started operating with a short-term vision where human capital is no more at the center of production. The precarious nature of jobs, low wages, minimal social security, and lack of opportunity for skill enhancement are the few defining characteristics of existing jobs in India, especially for the blue-collar workers. I hope you can see me properly. The low productivity of human capital is another testimony which reflects the adochism which the industrial ecosystem operates. It is due to these reasons that industry and its human capital lack understanding on their mutual welfare, which has led to a constant trust deficit between the two. We have recently witnessed a plethora of changes in the labor law regime undertaken by the Government of India. These changes are a long due reform first recommended by the Second National Commission of Labour in 2002. These changes addresses few, if not all, of the long pending concerns of industry as well as trade unions, which represents the human capital. However, these changes are the bone of contention between industry and human capital owing to their fundamental differences. As a matter of reality, the economic condition of human capital is not in good shape for a long time. As a consequence, we have seen the type of economic growth which has widened inequality in the Indian society, thereby adversely affecting the lives of millions. There is an inherent merit in preserving human dignity which leads to dignified economic growth. Therefore, it is imperative on us to explore ways through which human capital can be innovated, thereby ensuring its welfare in all its forms. We have prepared a note on existing business models in Indian industries which facilitate worker welfare. In this context, we aim to bring perspective from industry, workers' community, and academia to deliberate on the roadmap for reimagining workers as human capital rather than cost of production. Now, the slide deck which was presented is also available on our website. We'll be happy to receive any comments on that at a later date. With these brief remarks, let me now request the panelists. Each of them would be having about 8 to 10 minutes. And I would request that, if, and participants, as was already announced by Trinity, that they would, that they can, key in their questions to whichever panelist or the whole panel through the chat box. Let me start with Mr. Vijesh Upadhyay, General Secretary of BMS. The question is, the recently passed labor codes are being lauded for introducing measures for welfare of human capital and simultaneously criticized for making it easier for enterprises to arbitrarily govern the employment conditions of workers. In the backdrop of these labor codes, what is your opinion should be the main action points of an enterprise to ensure worker welfare? The second question is, what are the mechanisms which are in place right now and what are the current challenges related to worker welfare? Over to you, Vijesh. 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Pradeep ji. First, I would like to inform that last week only BMS has held its general conference, and now I am not the general secretary. I am looking after the research activity in the BMS. Binay Kumar Sinha, when he became general secretary, is also present here. So now Binay Sinha is our general secretary. So coming to the context again,
let me welcome Binay ji also.
Yes, he is here.
Thank you.
So coming to the context being discussed today, I have already appreciated. Again, I would like to appreciate Kurtz and Pradeep ji for bringing such an important context to discuss. First of all, I am not agree with the term using human as a capital. There may be debate, discussion, differences, but I think a human should be treated as a human, because adding any with the human, it has a different meaning. So I think in coming days, human will be human and discussion will be in and around that. The content I need to put here, I think before, I'm not the specialist in the labor laws. I'm not anything else. I am just a field worker. Based on my experience in the field, what I could understood so far about the labor laws so far, labor laws introduced recently and its future. So based on my field experience, because I have no this legal expertise, so I can't go into that detail, I can't explain that, but my experience in the field, definitely I would come to that. And I have been speaking on such issues since many of the time, and I am of the firm opinion that unfortunately we are coming with the ready-made policy, ready-made legislation, whereas we need a tailor-made approach to understand and to address the real concern of workers. Why I'm coming to this? Years together, I have seen debate, discussion overall such. There is discussion between academics and academics. Intellectuals are discussing, they are bringing lot of issues, but whether they are connecting or connected to the mass, the real needy, what actually they need, I find it very difficult. So discussion between academics to academics, intellectual to intellectual, it's going on since years together. So it need to get connected with the mass. Why I'm referring also because once we try to understand what is the society, what is the fabric of the society, what are the people for whom we are discussing, means workers. So if you see the Indian context, workmanship in India, majority for whom we are discussing here, mostly they are illiterate or semi-literate, or their literacy level is as much that they can't understand or interpret the schemes, their welfare measures and many other legislation to their favor. So this is the status of the workmanship. So how to address this? First, we all, means intellectual, government, those who are having concern to the address the workers' concern, they should first understand who they are. Without knowing them, bringing any scheme and designing any such scheme have no meaning. So they are this. And the next one is the problem of employment, unemployment and underemployment. This is compulsion before them. Even after knowing what are the rights available, what are the welfare schemes available, they are compelled to join under given circumstances, situations. This compulsion again needs to understand. Until unless we are aware of all such, we can't come to a conclusion and a workable conclusion. So this needs. The next, because since this codification of labor laws were on the way, lot of discussions were taking place. I have always used to say, I have seen people were correcting the grammar, the terminology, the English of this code. I am totally different. Having this some more laws, it is not going to create ease for the workers, because the main problem is non-enforcement of the labor laws. Nobody is discussing this. If having one more laws, what is the social security code, what others, what Pradeep is referring to me, to as a field worker, I have no meaning to all such labor laws. Still, even having their, even existing these laws has not created any lease. So main and fundamental issue is the enforcement of labor laws, and it is only and only ground to get it done is ethical mindset of the business industry. You can't imply or deploy police behind each and every. There are people who finds people expertise in the market how to escape from paying taxes, how to escape from enforcing labor laws. This expertise is available in the market. But how to create ease to the workers, how to provide, how to simplify or create ease in implementation, there is no agency in the market. So ethical mindset is the basic requirement to know, to understand how to enforce these labor laws. And any debate, any sort of this way forward, if it is twinned with the ethical approach, yes, of course, we can find the way forward and we can get it implement. So to me, it's a implementation big issue, and behind the implementation, the social fabric, the condition of the workers, the workmanship, the unemployment, these are the basic reason we are unable to enforce. Our workers are unable to ask for rightfully that I should get, because their basic need is roti, and roti without employment it can't come. So how to focus this thread, this is the basic fundamental to me. And if I go to this technical aspect, the enforcing agencies, it may be the labor central government labor department or state government labor department. What about their reach to the masses, to the workers, to the needy? It is not at all. It is means last year, I think last year when this Pradhan Mantri pension scheme was launched before the this Lok Sabha election. For launching this scheme, government has derived as a factor that maximum people should be enrolled. And after Lok Sabha election, I think you can find how many have added as a new member to that. Means labor department, people are sitting in their office, they are expecting people will come and they will fill up the form, they will join the scheme, then only scheme will be operational. A daily based worker, and he has to move around weeks together to find the appropriate office, the appropriate person, and leaving for a week their livelihood. How one can go? This is the fate of the enforcing agencies, the bureaucrats, the officers, the setup of this medication. And trade union equally, trade unions have not given the official role in such. Only in building and other construction worker, if any scheme is working comparatively, I'm not saying it's a fine one. This is the only scheme which has got at least enrollment, because others have also, means social actors have given the role. So this is the very big mechanism we have worked out so far. So until unless this mechanism, this system is not developed or strengthened, whatever scheme will come, it cannot be addressed, it cannot be found place, and workers' well-being cannot be ensured. So these are certain thank you. These are certain fundamentals needs to be focused. Thank you, Pradeep ji. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for highlighting it. Indeed, ethical business practices, you can only rely upon the enterprise to follow. You cannot have enforcement down the clock or all the time. There's no doubt about that. It's an enlightened and entrepreneur who's going to do that. With that, and I'll come to Shumita Ghosh. One of our panelists, Babu Matthew, has had to absent himself for some reasons. Shumita?
Yes, hello. Hello, good afternoon, everyone.
Yeah, the two questions to you. What is the rationale and motivation behind adhering to standards of fair trade, such as equal and fair wages, safe working conditions, capacity building, etc.? How are these compliances assured at an enterprise level? And secondly, what are the challenges in compliance of such standards? Can you provide few examples from your work experience in Rangasutra? Over to you, Shum. And 8 to 10 minutes.
Okay, so
I'll wave my hand to give you an indication.
All right, okay. So the first question, what is the rationale and motivation behind adhering to standards of fair trade, such as equal and fair wages, etc.? So the motivation is basically, in our own organization philosophy and ethics that we follow, my own personal belief and beliefs, in the sense that prior to setting up Rangasutra, I worked in the pure not-for-profit sector, working in rural India. And while working in rural India, in different parts of rural India, although I'm a city person by birth and education, what I realized is the main problem that most of rural India faces is lack of employment. So that was the problem on the one hand. On the other hand, what I also saw was that some of the artisans or rural Indians that I worked with, who were farmers mostly, also practiced crafts, handicrafts and handlooms. As you know that handicrafts and handlooms are the second largest source of employment in our country after agriculture. I know this doesn't technically come into all the probably organized labor and that kind of thing, but the reality on the ground is that agriculture and handlooms and handicrafts provide the second largest source of employment. So what we decided was, by we I mean the artisans and rural communities I had worked with before, we decided that, okay, so let's look for a way to make this, craft and handloom and handicraft sector sustainable. because we know that there's a demand both in the country as well as globally for handcrafted items. And there is a demand, there's a supply, but in the middle, the real wealth that is being created doesn't get down to the person who's actually making it. So that's why we, and of course, my inspiration in this work is also the Amul model. And therefore, when we started Rangsutra, the first thing I did was talk to the 2,000 artisans, 1,000 at that time, artisans that I had personally worked with in the beginning, and asked them if they were interested in being owners in the company. So I was skeptical initially, but surprisingly, they said yes, and many of them did not have money. Out of the 1,000 artisans, 800 were women. And so each one of them either had some money or they took loans from their self-help groups. And we started our company with the first paid up capital actually was 1,000 artisans who put in 1,000 rupees each. That was the first, that was our startup capital. And to which I added again with some friends and family. So essentially, that's very much in our DNA. It's not come from outside in the form of compliances. It's the philosophy we believe in. And we look at artisans, not just, okay, they are workers. We all are workers. I may be the managing director, but at heart, I am a worker, like we all are workers. And we invested a lot in building up skills of the artisans, of helping them go up the skill matrix, so to speak. So, realizing that this work which is so spread out, we are not going to be able to control it like in the typical management way with a supervisor, looking into everything. So we empowered artisans with relation to design, to quality, production management, quality control, etc. And to ensure that all of them, and also since they are owners, they have a stake in the business. So whenever we make profit, we all share the profit. We have artisan representation on the board. So out of the 7 board members, 4 are representative of artisan groups. So their voices are heard. We have, as I said, invested in training and other things. What are the kind of, so how do we ensure compliance? As you're saying, as I mentioned, it's basically there in our DNA, in our guiding principles, in our standard operating procedures, in our policies that guide our work. And I agree with the previous speaker that unless this is built in, this ethical mindset is built in, it's very difficult to, sort of follow it by an external policeman, so to speak. So what are the challenges that we face in such compliances? Very frankly, from the law point of view, we haven't faced many challenges. In fact, none, because we ensure minimum wages are paid, more than minimum wages are paid. We document the work properly so that each artisan gets his or her due. And, if you look at our company's, profit and loss statement, we find that out of 100, 60% of, say 55 to 60% is actually going either as wages to artisans or we have a big team of now 100 people and all very medium, not highly paid or anything. All of us are very modestly paid. And we believe that if, there is a win-win situation. If, as Mahatma Gandhi said, there's enough in this world for everyone's need, but not for a few people's greed. And, that's where this capital business, where people who just put in money and expect, who put in only money and expect that they're going to get the most out of it, that is the wrong approach to business, I feel. That is the 20th century approach. In the 21st century, I think, we have to put people in the center. And of course, because we work with natural products, environment is also key to our work. It's core to our work. So whether it's ensuring that we are not polluting the environment and that we are paying proper wages, we don't really face challenges. The only challenge is that we face a lot of unhealthy competition from some of our competitors who in the unorganized sector who may be undercutting prices and who don't have many overheads, not paying proper wages. So they are be able to supply in the domestic market similar products at a much lower cost, at a somewhat lower cost. And secondly, we face competition from machine-made goods, especially the power loom and mill-made, who because of their capacity have high economies of scale because of their high production capacity, and they can run 3 shifts, whereas we only have work on 1 shift because we work with people and not machines. We have machines we do use, but not much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shmita. Would you like, that was very interesting. And there's one factor that we've not mentioned is machines replacing labor, which has also been happening.
Yes.
But let's beside the point. May I now turn to Rituparna Chakrabarti, co-founder and executive vice president of TeamLease. Rituparna, are you there?
Yeah, I'm there.
Good. Yeah, I 3 questions to you. This is on gig or platform work is the current buzzword in the recruitment circles in India and across the globe. The pandemic seems to have given a boost to the gig economy, and recruitment of gig workers are on the rise across the skills spectrum. Given that gig economy recognizes workers as independent contractors and not employees, what are its implications on workers' welfare? And finally, what are the existing mechanisms and which mechanisms can be put in place for human capital innovation in a gig economy? 8 to 10 minutes, please.
Thank you. Mr. Mehta, with your permission, I think there were a couple of points which have already been made by Brijesh ji, by Ms. Ghosh. And if you allow me, I will put some of the points which is around compliance and the compliance and labor perspective. And I will come to the gig aspect because gig is essential. That aspect is linked to essentially what happened in the labor.
Fair enough.
So I'm going to start by, if you allow me, I'm going to just give you a glimpse of something which will tell you about what essentially is the complexity that we are talking about. And then I will just take you through. Is it possible for somebody to enable the screen sharing for me? So just to give you all a perspective of what employers in India have been So what essentially is the challenge in terms of operating business in India for different kinds of enterprises across all industries? So this is just a slide which is trying to give you a holistic picture of that complexity. So essentially, this is the challenge that we've all struggled with is that we've struggled with multiple laws, we've struggled with multiple definitions, we've struggled with multiple enforcement authorities, and we've struggled with multiple registrations. So for any organization of medium to medium size, there are more than 29 forms of numbers that one has to procure to just operate business in this country, and 29 different people, some from the state, some from the central government. So what essentially this talks about is that if a business has to operate, there are compliances across environmental, health and safety, finance, taxation, general, commercial, industry-specific, secretarial, and labor laws. Incidentally, labor law consists of almost 47% of the overall compliances, and the acts and the filings. And we've also tried to give you color in terms of from a state specific, what is the spread of it all. Now, we have all now witnessed the 4 labor codes. And it's important, that's why, to share with you that what has changed if this is our reality. Essentially, what has changed is that there are right now 4 acts which have been out of the 44 acts, 29 acts actually have become the 4 labor codes. And 4 of the acts around different parts, different types of wages correlations have been part of the wage codes. So from the current of their organizations having to file 3 returns 12 registers spanning across these 4 acts, they are now, based on the code, would be expected to have 1 return and at max 4 registers. So overall, we are looking at a 92% reductions in registers that organizations had to file earlier, and almost 67% around returns. And similarly, IR codes, there are about 3 acts which have been subsumed. Currently, as against 2 registrations, I think we were looking at just about 1 single registration under the code. Then the OSH, which is Occupational Safety and Health. There are 13 acts which have been subsumed. And based on the current, across the 13, there are 4 licenses to be taken, 11 registrations, about 22 returns, about 76 registers. With the labor codes, that's coming down to 1 license, 1 registration, 1 return, and about 2-3 registers. So overall, I'm looking at a 95% reduction by and large across all buckets. Social Security, about 9 acts, which have been subsumed, and from about 4 registers, 36 returns, and 4 registration, 36 returns, and 20 registers, we're coming down to 1 registration, 1 return, and about 1 or 2. Again, a reduction of 90%. So I think that's the backdrop of the before and after that we can visualize for ourselves. So that also that brings me to the point which was raised about compliance as a practice. I have a little bit of a difference of opinions where one believes that if you have, that ethical mindset can be coded in human beings. Look, I always have had this issue, right? That when we are driving in India, we tend to break all rules. But when we are driving in United States or in UK or in Europe, we adhere by the rules. It's the same human being, right? Why do we behave differently in 2 different contexts? It's because of compliance. It's because of supervision. It's because someone's watching us. And that's where I kind of agree with Vijeshji when he says that compliance and implementations are very important. So that's just to respond to a few of the stuff that have already been discussed. Now on gig. So it's important for all of us to acknowledge that first time in the country we have legislatively recognized the definition of gig. So today, as per the Social Security Code, gig worker means a person who performs work or participates in a work arrangement and earns from such activities outside of traditional employee-employee relationship. We've done a very good job in terms of getting the definition right. What essentially it means is that it's a form of work where there is no employer-employee relationship, which means human beings are right now offering themselves as services, right? Where the highest bidder is going to avail them, and they could be for a specific time duration, for a certain quality of work that needs to get rendered. No one owes each other anything beyond what has been agreed for that specific time frame and that particular project or assignment or task. So from that perspective, I think we've done a good job. What right now from the perspective of welfare, the code has suggested, now I could have difference of opinion with the code. What the code has tried to do is, the code has tried to introduce something called a dedicated social security fund for gig workers. Of course, the government is probably going to, through the rulemaking process, tell us how they exactly intend to fund it. At the moment, let's assume the government is funding it out of the penalties and other contraventions and compounding collections that will happen through that. What essentially it is trying to do is it's trying to aims to protect them for any kind of unemployment insurance. It's trying to protect them for any kind of health insurance and protection that workers might need. It is also trying to, whether again I have disagreement, trying to protect them from old age, also from the perspective of maternity benefits, because there are mentions in this. So there is no clear guideline or rules, but the government has given itself the empowerment to make certain scheme-specific rules for these requirements. So from my perspective, when we talk about the welfare of gig workers, what is essential definitely is giving them access, but with choice, to have some kind of health accidental insurance protection, because I think that's important for them. If we are trying to regulate too much their wages, if we are trying to now regulate too much on old age or maternity, we actually defeat the very purpose of gig, or why gig proliferated in the first place as an alternate form of work. Most people are looking at it from the lens of the benefits that implicitly employers have from a gig arrangement. But there are huge benefits in it for even those who participate as being gig workers. I'm sure many of you have read about the AB5, which is trying to heavily regulate the gig segment in California. There is huge criticism and pushback even from workers, because they wanted to be part of that ecosystem. Their view of welfare is that, please allow me choice, please allow me flexibility, please don't determine when I should show up for work. I would like to have all this with me, right? I might want to do a regular job, and I might want to also do a gig work. I might want to do 5 gig works. And if I'm working with 5 gig works, I actually don't have an employer. And hence, who should really take responsibility for any of these benefits or funds that the government is coming out with? So if you were to ask me, the bare essential for them would definitely be some kind of a fund to some degree, which protects them or hedges them for potential job loss, like in the case of pandemic. And there should be some kind of access to low-cost health insurance and accidental insurance. Everything else, I feel, is really right now not the mandate that one can look at. So that's my limited point, Mr. Mehta.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, would you not consider a gig worker to be a self-employed person?
Absolutely. It's a self-employed, but then, yeah, absolutely. It's a self-employed. You might call it self-employed. I might call it that I'm running my own. I am my business.
Yeah, you're a contractor. So
I'm a contractor, I'm a service, whichever way, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
That's how it is.
Right. May I now request Mr. Bharat Waklu. Bharat, 3
Yes.
questions to you. What are the key conflicts faced by an enterprise when it comes to reducing costs and increasing profits? How important is worker welfare from the point of view of an enterprise? And third, what are the mechanisms that can be adopted by a business to improve stakeholder welfare, including worker welfare, and simultaneously increase its profits? Over to you. 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you, Pradeep ji. I adhere my time, and but before I respond to your 3 questions, I think it's important for us to just look back at the history of enterprise. And I have a very, very strong view that enterprise for the past 500-600 years has largely followed the rules of engagement, which haven't changed. Which means that if you don't change the fundamental structure of how businesses operate and what are the metrics that guide them, you will keep on having the same outcome. So frankly, going back 500 years, the first businesses in Europe, in America and elsewhere actually were driven solely by the profit motive. And it did not matter how they made their surpluses, which lands they raided, which people they enslaved, what they exploited. It just didn't matter. And quite frankly, that was the era when any kind of restraint on business didn't exist. In fact, the almost 300-400 years later, we started thinking about labor regulations, and India got its first Factories Act in 1881, which by today's standard looks extremely tame and very, very watered down from what is required. So the point I'm trying to make is that the fundamental way of converting natural resources into goods and services as a model of business, that hasn't changed one bit. So how do we expect that businesses will become suddenly very enlightened and will treat people appropriately and so on? And what's also been seen is since the Middle Ages to the way all the way to the 19th and 20th centuries, the amount of regulation has crept and become more and more complicated. And today we're talking about many more rules and regulations that companies have to comply with. Although Rituparna did explain that the recent labor codes have made it a little easier. The point, of course, being that until and unless we change the metrics that govern business, we will not see a radical change. Now, what do I mean by changing the metrics of business? We have to appreciate that so far, businesses have always counted their surpluses based on some inputs and what they do, how they add value, and then the outputs and the revenue that they get from the outputs. There is no question of how it affects their people, how it affects the environment, how the actions of the business create externalities which are not accounted for or which are expected to be borne by the businesses, and not by the businesses but the governments of the day. So frankly, there is a complete skewed way of measuring business performance. So I was very, very happy when your colleagues made that presentation at the very beginning and provided some performance-based, methods to gauge the performance of business. I'm saying that has to become commonplace, and we have to start with a new paradigm of business for us to be able to get business to not only focus on more humane workforce practices and labor law compliance, but more importantly, they have to also figure out ways and means by which their business does not adversely impact the environment or the water bodies or the air or the quality of life of people generally. So without that modification in the manner in which we function our businesses, I'm afraid we'll be going around in circles. We may tighten the regulations. We might want leaders to become more humane, more ethical in their own personal conduct. And we want to elevate their consciousness, which is a beautiful thing to do. But fundamentally, businesses have got to be measured differently. So that's my starting premise. And obviously this will lead up to the answers to the three questions that you have posed as well. So that's point number one. Point number two is we have to appreciate that businesses have got to create wholesome value. What is this concept of wholesome value? Wholesome value means it can't only be surpluses that are money surpluses. Money surpluses don't mean a thing if you wreck the environment, if you pollute the rivers, if you kill the fish in the oceans, if you overexploit the Amazonian rainforest, or if you leave people like we saw in India during the pandemic having to fend for themselves. There is something fundamentally wrong and erroneous in that model of surpluses where value is being given, but where you pretend that you're making great profits. So there is a mismatch. And I'm also saying that the value pie has to be expanded for all stakeholders rather than eroded. And we need to make that a part of the way businesses function. Because without that, what we will see is that environmental sustainability, social justice, humane businesses, and what I call life-affirming businesses will not occur. Businesses have got to be life-affirming. What good is it if a business is making huge profits, but in the process it is making our planet and our water bodies dark and cinder-like? So there's that kind of a mismatch has to change. So what does therefore mean? What it means therefore is leadership standards and regulation has to therefore be aligned differently. With this fundamental change, we need more conscious and more compassionate leaders. A point that was made both by Vijesh ji and Ms. Ghosh and Rituparna also talked about ethical leaders and so on. I think that's a very, very important requirement. And it starts off not only with business leaders. With due respects, I must say that many of our parliamentarians who are lawmakers, many of them, almost close to 49% of them, have criminal cases against them. So it starts with that as well. It's not only businesses who have to become ethical. The lawmakers who write the rules, who make the laws for this nation, they too have to rise up and become more conscious, more ethical. Number two, the role of business and industry-led standards. the likes of CII, FICCI, PHE Chamber, ASSOCHAM, even the BMS-like organizations, they have to come together to ensure that every business has got to comply with the requirements of what is an appropriate value creating enterprise, not profit creating, value creating for all stakeholders. Because if we don't have that uniform pressure from the industry on everybody, we will see what Subita Ghosh talked about, that there are some guys who will cut costs, will not pay full wages, will cut corners, and who might therefore be able to charge a lower price than a legitimate artisan who is actually performing his duty with diligence and devotion. And finally, there is also, as Brajeshji rightly said in his opening remarks, there is a need for comprehensive enforcement of the existing rules. Because without enforcement, Pradeepji, we are going to be ending up with, a plethora of rules. I'm so happy that these labor codes have at least set out of the radar screen many of the rules that have been there for ages, but who knows, no one was even bothering about except at that point of filing. So these kinds of rules need to exist. There has to be tight enforcement, and then alone will we see a change. And finally, because we are, a large part of our workforce is in the unorganized self-employed sector, and as Rituparna very rightly said, many of the youngsters today prefer to be gig workers. They don't want to be employees. They prefer to work in conditions where they can wake up at their own time, do what they want to do, make some money, and get back to something else. So we need to create what is known as a UBI or a DSSF, a dedicated social security fund, because you cannot have any kind of freedom of doing what you want to do, what you have the skills for, if you don't have a basic income, a universal basic income which provides you sustenance. It may not be enough for you to have a great bank balance, but it's enough to sustain you. Now, coming to your queries, the conflicts that businesses face today, Pradeep ji, arise because the cost, the reduction of cost is perceived to be a legitimate goal. But if you flip this, as I said, and start thinking about value expansion as a goal, then this conflict will not be there, because even human welfare, even worker welfare will be a value adding activity, much like Jamshedji Tata did in his mills in Nagpur in the latter part of the 18th century, 19th century. He created a mill that is so different from Lancashire and Manchester, because he believed, he was a compassionate soul, and he went about it because he believed in it. But I think new metrics of business have to make it necessary for businesses to be value creating rather than profit making. And this concept, I would like to leave with you, Pradeepji, and I'm sure Guts can delve deeper into this, because it is the need of the hour. And finally, the second point that you said, worker welfare. Of course, worker welfare is a very essential part of enterprise, because if you want to create legitimacy in what you're doing, if you want to create value comprehensively, workers are going to be part of that. How can you be part of the web of life, and how can you erode the happiness or the quality of life of a very, very important living being like a human being, those who work for you? And finally, the third question was, what mechanisms can businesses adopt to improve the welfare of its stakeholders? Well, I think the first mechanism really is start changing the way you measure business success and business performance. And if you become a value expanding company, even the business models, Pradeepji, that you follow will be different. For instance, today we talk about the linear model of business. You extract minerals, you change them, you dump the waste outside. But I'm saying, look, what about the circular model of enterprise? What about reusing what we have? What about not having ownership of output or goods at all? So these are some of the ideas we need to work on. The time has come. It is we could, right now, this pandemic has really kind of brought us to an inflection point. And if we do not collectively alter our thinking on these lines, Pradeep ji, I think we will be continuing with the same problems for a very, very long time. But this is a great opportunity for us to relook and transform ourselves. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sanjay, over to you. Bharat, included, has been extremely thoughtful in what he has suggested. And you may like to expand upon that with a similar kind of background. And as the question which have already been sent to you, that how can a large conglomerate ensure the welfare of its workers across the skills and jobs spectrum? Do large conglomerates commit to reduce the gap between the employees at the highest and the lowest level? That is, inequality is very important, which is a global phenomena. It's a national phenomena. What we are now witnessing is somebody like Mukesh Ambani making 8 crore every minute, as against a small worker not even making 8 rupees every minute. What are the ways in which businesses can be motivated for human capital innovation and dignified growth? Can you provide some examples from your work experience? Over to you.
Sure. Thanks so much, Pradeep and Kurtz. Good afternoon, and thank you. I am the last speaker, so it gives me a tremendous opportunity that India is a land of managing the diverse views and the different points of view. So let me try to be the bridge between Bharat and India, which so many of the speakers speak about. Yeah. And because I come from the Bharat, but I worked a good part of my working life I spent in the India, but I am still connected. And so let me take these two questions, which are very important. And human mind remembers it best if you have some representative visuals. So let me try to create a visual by using that these questions or this framework, as well as what so many of my distinguished panelists talked of, all of this to use dignified economic growth by effective use of human capital and innovation. There can be, if we build 3 bridges right, we build these 3 bridges right, we will actually end up achieving the 3 key objectives which India is currently having. The first, economic growth. The second, the GDP growth. And both of these driven by the fact that employment generation. So let me talk about the first important framework of bridge. The first bridge, I think, to assimilate what everyone said, is I think value enhancement is really the bridge for success. As long as we will use a traditional price profit equation, it is an unequal comparison. The real transformation can come when we are doing a value chain enhancement in each and every aspect. And when we do that, the overall ecosystem value increases. And this is not something which has not been done earlier. In fact, whether you pick up some of the largest conglomerates, Bharat referred to that, whether it is Tata Group, whose motto is to leadership with trust. Really, if you see who does Tata work for, everyone knows that more than 66% of it is owned by trust. Yeah, so there are various stakeholders, but ultimately a lot of it is growing back. So it is always to create a better society. Whether you pick up a conglomerate like Mahindra, whose core philosophy about business is how do you rise? So how do you really create a positive impact across this same spectrum? When we look at value enhancement, you need not even look at a very big conglomerate, even the smallest of the MSMEs. If you I just pick up example of the latest COVID-19 pandemic, the smallest companies which were most innovative, the smallest companies where workers were most engaged and committed that how quickly they can go back, whether it is as someone as simple as doing a e-commerce delivery or taking all the risk on behalf of all of us to ensure we stay safe while the essential services was running. That was coming from engagement, and that was coming when people felt safe and committed to a higher belief. So the first bridge is the philosophy has to be focused on value enhancement on the chain. The second very important thing, we can speak about many things, but actually kaise hoga? And again, someone talked of we are going round and round. I'll pick up a philosophical point from the Indian philosophy, that the Indian philosophy is while time is circular, but the concept is spiral. It is like a shank. So every time you come back, you actually come back at a higher point if you are evolving. So if that is there, many of these inherent values which have been built on, many of the people spoke about, whether it is dignity, whether it is about doing the right thing, whether it is about not being unfair to everyone, it is actually built in. And now if you see the current context, there are well-defined framework which has come in. If you see, everyone earlier used to talk about people, planet, and profit. If you now see what everyone is following, which is the UN Sustainable Development Goal, more than 90% of those 17 SDGs are set up entirely on ensuring economic prosperity. So if you look at people part, it is about peace and prosperity. If you look at about the profit part, it is the focus is on ending the poverty. And if you look about the planet, as Bharat as well as some of the other speakers spoke about, it is about sustainable planet. So even in the new environment, whether it is a gig economy or whether it will be a new manufacturing, irrespective, the framework has to be applied, and we follow the framework and we commit to using it. We commit to implementing, not just as some of the people talked about compliance, but truly following it in letter and spirit. The actual value will be much higher than where we have ended with. So that is where it will drive both a decent work and the economic growth. And the third and the very important aspect, चाहे वो ब्रिजेश जी ने बोला कि माइंडसेट का चेंज है, या ऋतुपर्णा जी ने बताया कि बहुत सारे चेंजेस हैं पर इस सबको कैसे इनकॉर्पोरेट करना है. The third most important bridge which I see is the bridge of skill development. And when I talk of skill development, I actually elevate it to the higher level where it's not an individual level of skill development, because as we talked about, every traditional model, economy, government, and individual is changing. So the skill development is really going to be the bridge for this success at 3 levels. For the first, for the government, the skill development has to be in terms of a mindset where it is liberal in reforms, but have a enabling mindset. And that is where some of these changes are coming. For the industries, definitely you focus on the business objective achievements, because ultimately if you will not deliver value, how will you actually share the value? So please focus on the business objective. But the most successful ones, whether we talked about a Mahindra and Tata, or we talk about a Starbucks or anything which you want to hire, they have a humane approach. And thirdly, when we come about the individual, very important. The world is changing whether you like it or not. So how will you focus on yourself to ensure you are learning, relearning, and value will increase. And from a mindset perspective, just as we say, you give respect and hence you take respect. So please take products, please take local goods, please actually use the local resources, because then that is what you really enable it. So in conclusion, I want to say the ownership, when Bharat and India really work together, and that is where really the value enhancement happens. That's what I would want to do.
Thank you very
Thanks.
much. Thank you. Thank you very much. We are now coming to very close to our end. And I had invited Mr. Uday Kumar Verma. Mr. Uday Kumar Verma to please, he's a very old friend and has been Secretary for Ministry of Information and Broadcasting, before which he's also headed the National Labour Institute from the time that I knew him. Uday Kumarji, 2 minutes, please.
Okay. You have.
What do you think are the sort of most important highlight?
I think basically it was a very enlightening thing. My concerns are only 2, 3. I'll be extremely brief. One is that this labor code, all these 3, 4 labor codes, have brought about a paradigm change. Since 1920, the way the whole labor scenario was seen and perceived, it's going to change completely. And nobody knows it better than Brijesh ji, and he would concede that this whole concept of tripartism is going to diminish substantially, number one. Secondly, government is withdrawing. If you raise the level of threshold level to 300 for lockouts and closures, then obviously you are leaving it between the workers and the employer. So government is withdrawing. It's a good thing, bad thing, I'm not commenting on that, but the government is withdrawing. Thirdly, we are moving towards informalization. And there's a contradiction. In MSME, we want more unorganized units to get organized, get formalized, get registered. Here, perhaps there is a shift to informalize things. If I had time, I would have expanded on each one of these. But what I am going to say is that it's any policy will work if it is balanced. Balance is the key. Everybody, talked about this in one way or the other. Balance is essential. Otherwise, it will not sustain. And therefore, the onus is on employers now. Onus is on employers now. Government has done its bit, I must say. Government has done its bit. It has withdrawn. It has made inspections irrelevant. Practically, there'll be no inspections. It has completely rationalized number of returns. So government has definitely done its bit. It is now up to the employers. And when we talk about employers, we don't think about Tatas and Mahindras, which is a typical employer on the ground. So we have to keep that in mind. And if employers miss this opportunity, and lots of people talked about it, the ethics of it, that there should be a new way of defining business. There should be a new mindset. I entirely agree. On the ground, I wish and hope and pray that some of it gets translated. I think that I'll stop at that.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. And I think, Udayji, what we'll do is we should have a further conversation on this on at least a closer loop. Some of these ideas so that we can take them forward. It's part of Kutch's philosophy that we engage in events which are part of our work program, where we think it is important for us to continue to intervene so that the world is a better place to live in, rather than just to do an event for the sake of event. And this project, as I said earlier, that is about creating good and better jobs and reducing inequality, which is quite a bane on humanism. With that, may I now request my colleague Vipul Chatterjee to please propose a vote of thanks and to summarize as briefly as he would like to.
धन्यवाद मिस्टर मेहता, आपका अनुमति से मैं हिंदी में बोलने का कोशिश करूंगा। पहले मैं समराइज करना चाहता हूं, बीच बीच में थोड़े बहुत अंग्रेजी में शब्द आ जाएंगे जरूर। मैं दो बातें कहूंगा बड़े संक्षेप में। पहला बात, कैसे ये अब तो कानून बड़ा आसान हो गया, इन्फोर्समेंट कैसे करें, इसमें मेरे पास सवाल है, सवाल का जवाब अभी नहीं है। इसमें काफी सारे पहलू हमें देखना पड़ेगा और आज के जो विषय पर जैसे चर्चा हुआ, मेरे ख्याल से ये सब बहुत सारे पहलू को हम जरूर नोट किए हैं, इसमें और गैर से हमें अध्ययन करना पड़ेगा। ये बड़े खुशी की बात है कि ब्रिजेश जी ने आप बीएमएस की जो अध्ययन प्रमुख बन गए, तो हम अब सभी के साथ मिलके ये काम करेंगे। दूसरी बात है कि इस एथिकल बिजनेस, इसमें भी मेरे ख्याल से कोई लॉ, कोई रेगुलेशंस, इससे ऊपर उठ के हमें सोचना पड़ेगा। मैं एक छोटा सा उदाहरण देना चाहता हूँ। जैसे कि हमारे राजस्थान में शारदा एक्ट है जो कि चाइल्ड मैरिज के खिलाफ है। तो एक्ट तो है, काफी सालों से है, लेकिन अभी भी वो चाइल्ड मैरिज चल रहा है। तो हमें समाज को ऐसे बात करके, जो बिजनेस करता है, जो एंटरप्राइज चला रहा है, वो तो समाज का ही अंग है। जैसे संजय जी ने बहुत अच्छी तरह, भरत जी ने भी कहा, सभी ने कहा। तो हमें समाज, सरकार और बाजार, ये तीनों का कैसे अच्छा तालमेल बैठे, इसमें ध्यान देना पड़ेगा। मैं ये कह नहीं रहा हूं कि मुनाफा खराब चीज है, मुनाफाखोरी जरूर खराब है। मैं ये कहूंगा कि एक एंटरप्राइज, ये इतने सारे कंप्लायंस अब कम हो गया, फिर भी अगर लेबर को थोड़ा ज्यादा पैसा मिले तो उसका मुनाफा और कम होगा। लेकिन ये जरूरी नहीं है कि मुनाफा कम होगा। अगर हम और भी कॉस्ट कंपोनेंट्स देखें, उसमें कैसे कम हम कर सके, ताकि मुनाफा भी बढ़े और हमारा लेबर को भी फायदा हो। मैं इस अंत में सिर्फ एक चीज कहूंगा, ब्रिजेश जी ने बोला कि जो इन्फोर्समेंट बड़ा वीक है, जरूर वीक है। मैं भी मेरे एक्सपीरियंस से ही बात कर रहा हूँ। ना केवल सरकारी अफसरों का बात ब्रिजेश जी ने जरूर कहा है, ट्रेड यूनियन वाले को, खास करके जो लोकल लेवल पे है, उनका भी काफी हद तक इसमें योगदान है। कि अगर कोई एंटरप्राइज, कोई यूनिट ढंग से कंप्लायंस नहीं कर रहे, वेजेस ठीक से नहीं दे रहे, टाइम पर नहीं दे रहे, पीएफ जमा नहीं कर रहे, ईएसआई का पैसा नहीं जमा कर रहे, तो नेता लोग किसके पास जाएगा? लेबर साहब के पास ही जाएगा। अब लेबर साहब के पास जाके वो क्या बात कर रहे हैं? लेबर साहब बोल रहे हैं कि चलो हमारे पास पैसा नहीं है, हम नहीं कर पा रहे। तो यूनियन वाले बोले ठीक है, आप मत कीजिए, हम संभाल लेंगे। ये है आज की जमीनी हकीकत। तो हमें, जैसे मेहता साहब ने कहा कि हम इसमें और से अध्ययन करेंगे, और ये अध्ययन एकेडमिक नहीं होगा, प्रैक्टिकल होगा। आप सबके साथ मिलके, खास करके उदय जी के साथ मिलके बड़ा खुशी हुई कि हम जब ट्रेड एंड लेबर स्टैंडर्ड्स की प्रोजेक्ट कर रहे थे आज से 20 साल पहले, उदय जी के साथ हम काम किए हैं। तो हम ऐसे ही इसको आगे बढ़ाएंगे। तो मैं सबको फिर से धन्यवाद देना चाहता हूँ, ब्रिजेश जी, भरत जी, संजय जी, सुमिता जी, ऋतुपर्ण जी, let me, on behalf of CUTS, let me thank all of you. And this is a continuous process. And when are we going to reach that outcome? That's something which also we need to see. But my personal opinion is that it's not going to happen just as a result of laws and regulations. We need much more than that. The question is whether we have a Vinoba Bhave or a JP of that kind of a personality who can create moral conscience among us, generate that conscience. That is something which you need to think about and find about. Thank you very much.
There have been many questions. Unfortunately, since we have run out of time, we are not able to. And I find that our sixth panelist, Babu Matthew, has also joined us. But I'm very sorry that since we are running against time, we will not be able to take it further. But what may I request you that for those who have these questions, they could send them an email. Send an email to us and we'll see to it that it is sent out and that it is answered in a group format, so that it's a kind of a continuation of this webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Have a good day.